He sat quietly by the window, first row on the left, his coat folded neatly on his lap, the small metal tag on his dog chain catching the sunlight just enough to flash once and then vanish beneath the worn fabric. The man was a war veteran, not that anyone cared. Not anymore, not really. And as the other passengers boarded, dragging their carry-ons and juggling phones, he stayed still, looking out at the tarmac like it meant something, like he was trying to remember if the sky had ever looked different when it wasn't just a roof over someone else's escape. Then a man, younger, clearly rich by the way he held his leather briefcase and wore sunglasses indoors, stopped in front of him, eyes narrowing slightly, lips pressing into something that wasn't quite a smile, and with a voice low enough to carry threat but polite enough to mask it, he said, "I think you're in the wrong seat, old man. You should move." And the veteran blinked once, turned slowly, caught the man's face full on for the first time, and saw not hostility, but something worse, indifference. The kind that bleeds from a life of always getting what you want and never thinking twice about what it costs someone else. He replied, calm but confused, that the ticket said 1A, that he'd saved up for this seat for months, that he'd triple-checked at the gate, and for a second, it looked like maybe the other man would just move on. Maybe it had been a mistake. But instead, he stood firmer, now blocking the aisle, repeating, louder this time, that this wasn't right, that someone like him shouldn't be here, not in the front, not near the quiet, not near people who matter. And a few heads began to turn. A stewardess 2 rows back glanced nervously and took a step forward, but not enough to interrupt yet. And the veteran, still seated, still calm, just looked up and asked slowly, deliberately, what made the man think he had the right to decide who belonged where. To which the man scoffed and said he didn't need to explain himself to someone like him, and then gestured to the stewardess with a casual flick like he was summoning staff in a hotel, saying, "This man's in my seat. He shouldn't be here. He makes people uncomfortable." And the stewardess now fully approached, blinking, unsure whose version to trust, looking from the pressed suit to the weathered face, hesitating, and in that second a quiet started to build. Not the loud drama of shouting, but a cold, slow tension, the kind that seeps into a room when something wrong is happening, but no one wants to be the first to say it. And as she gently asked for boarding passes, the veteran held his out with a steady hand, while the rich man talked over her, louder now, adding details that weren't true, that the man had pushed him, that he'd been aggressive, and the stewardess looked overwhelmed, torn between protocol and pressure. And somewhere near the back of the plane, someone murmured something, not loud enough to understand, but it rippled through the cabin, and now eyes were watching, dozens of them, watching this quiet man in seat 1A, who hadn't moved, hadn't shouted, just looked tired in the kind of way that didn't come from jet lag or bad sleep, but from the long wait of years filled with things he couldn't unsee, things he never talked about. And still, he said nothing, just waited. "What do you think you're doing?" the veteran said at last, his voice low but with a steadiness that cut through the man's condescension like a knife. "I paid for this seat, scraped it together from what was left of my pension after the hospital bills and the rent. I booked it months ago just to feel, for once, like I wasn't invisible, like I could sit by the window and not be treated like I didn't belong." But the rich man didn't flinch, didn't apologize. Instead, he rolled his eyes, pulled out his phone, and waved for the stewardess like he was ordering another drink, his voice already louder now as she approached, deliberately. So, trying to control the narrative before it even began, saying loudly, confidently, that this man and this passenger was sitting in a seat that didn't suit him, that he was being difficult, that it was unsettling for other guests, which wasn't true but sounded plausible enough to someone not paying attention. The stewardess, who had been smiling automatically the whole walk down the aisle, now hesitated, her expression flickering for just a second as she registered the situation, her eyes scanning the veteran's ticket, then glancing up at his face. Not angry, not aggressive, just tired and holding on to something deep and quiet that didn't match the noise being made around him. She asked politely, trying to diffuse, "What seems to be the issue, sir?" And the rich man jumped in before the veteran could speak, saying, "I just think there should be a standard, for who sits in first class. It's not personal. It's just that this doesn't look right. He gestured subtly toward the veteran's worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, the gray hair tucked under a cap with a small faded emblem no one else in the cabin seemed to recognize, and then added, "He's making people uncomfortable. I'm sure I'm not the only one thinking it." And that's when the veteran turned fully to face him and said, with the same calm voice, "You think I don't know what this is? You think I haven't seen men like you before, in different clothes, with different flags, talking down to the ones who bled so they could pretend the world was made for them." The cabin was quieter now, the ambient chatter dying as the moment dragged on. The passengers close enough to hear pretending to scroll their phones while listening intently, and the stewardess seemed frozen, looking between them with the expression of someone who knew that no matter what she said, it would be wrong to someone. And then, unexpectedly, the rich man said, loud and clear, "I don't care who he is. I don't care what he's done. It doesn't matter. I don't want to sit next to someone like that. I want this seat, and you should make him move." And for a moment it felt like something cracked in the air, like the plane itself held its breath. And that's when another voice entered, firm and unhurried. The captain, tall, composed, and clearly just briefed on what was unfolding, now standing behind the stewardess, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the rich man. He said quietly but with unmistakable authority, "Step away from him now, or you'll be removed from this flight and fined. No discussion." And the rich man opened his mouth as if to argue, but something in the captain's face made him stop. Some unspoken line that had just been crossed. And so, with a small scoff and a look that tried to save face but couldn't quite hide the sting, he stepped back and muttered something under his breath, returning to his original seat without further protest, while the stewardess, still holding the scanner and the ticket, exhaled softly and offered the veteran a bottle of water with a wordless nod. And he took it slowly, but didn't drink it, just held it and turned back toward the window again, his eyes focused on the wing outside as if nothing had happened. And for the rest of the flight, no one said anything else to him, though the silence around him was heavier than before, filled with the things people now knew but wouldn't say, the truths they had seen in a flash and then buried again beneath politeness and headphones. And somewhere far down the aisle, the man who had tried to displace him sat still, hands clenched, eyes darting around like he was trying to rewrite what had just happened in his head. But it was too late. The quiet had already spoken louder than anything else ever could. The stewardess, who until now had tried to stay measured, suddenly stood straighter, her voice no longer caught between neutrality and politeness. And with something closer to disbelief than anger, she said, "What are you doing, sir? Do you hear yourself? This is a war veteran you're talking to like that? A man who served this country when people like you were still figuring out how to lace their shoes? And you're demanding he move because, what, he doesn't look rich enough to sit by a window?" Her tone had shifted entirely. Not yelling, but sharp, personal, the way people speak when something finally breaks inside. And though the cabin was still hushed, you could feel every passenger now listening more openly, turning slightly, no longer hiding their curiosity or discomfort behind phone screens or forced coughs. The rich man, still standing in the aisle, looked thrown off for the first time, like he hadn't expected pushback from someone in uniform, and his face flushed in that pale, expensive way that said he wasn't used to being spoken to like this. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, said louder, as if volume would make him more correct, "I don't care who he is. I don't care what he's done. I paid for my seat too, and I want to sit there next to the window, not next to someone like him, and don't talk to me about service. I pay more in taxes in a month than he probably made in a year." And that was it. The moment it tipped from arrogance to something uglier. And before the stewardess could even respond, the captain was already beside her, calm and immovable, his presence changing the air like a shift in pressure before a storm. And he said, with a clipped, practiced authority that made people look up from rows 3 and 4, as if summoned, "Step away from this passenger immediately, or you will be fined and removed from this aircraft. No warnings, no appeals. The decision is mine." The man froze, caught between ego and consequences, and for a second, no one knew what he would do. The silence was so complete, you could hear the engine still humming low outside. But then, something broke behind his eyes. A flicker of realization, of embarrassment maybe, or fear, or shame too muted to name. And he nodded once stiffly, turned to the veteran, and said, without meeting his eyes, I apologize. I shouldn't have said that. I was out of line. And then, oddly, he added, maybe hoping it would fix something. I can pay for your ticket, really? Or cover your next one, or... But the veteran, still seated, still quiet, looked up and said only, go in peace, son. I'm not angry. I've just seen too much of this world to be surprised anymore. And then turned back toward the window without waiting for an answer. The rich man stood there another second, unsure what to do with the offer that hadn't been accepted. Then nodded awkwardly, mumbled something like, okay, okay, and returned to his seat farther down the cabin, avoiding eye contact the entire way. The stewardess didn't say anything else. She just nodded at the veteran, adjusted the cart near her, and resumed walking down the aisle with her professional calm restored, though her eyes looked a little brighter now, more alert. The passengers, too, settled back in, the tension folding itself into silence, and the rest of the flight passed without another word exchanged. No outbursts, no looks, just the quiet of people sitting with the discomfort of what they'd seen and heard. Somewhere over the ocean, as the seatbelt sign lit and the cabin dimmed, a few glanced up at 1A again, just for a moment. But the veteran didn't notice. He was already leaning against the window, eyes half closed, as if the sky outside still held something worth looking at.